They say the woods have eyes, but in November 1979, one man found out they also have claws. Usually, when we talk about encounters, we're dealing with blurry photos or lights dancing in the distance, things easily dismissed by skeptics. But what happens when the impossible touches down, leaves physical tracks in the mud, and violently attacks a war veteran? We aren't looking at a ghost story today. We are looking at the only UFO encounter in history to be officially investigated by the police as a criminal assault. I'm your host, Midnight Rider, and welcome back to Channel 19 Mysteries. Before we step past the tree line, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the frequency, and leave a comment down below if you think we are truly alone in the universe. Now, let's get into tonight's story. The Dechmont Woods incident. To understand why this case is so compelling, you first have to understand the man at its center. In the world of UFO encounters, credibility is everything, and you couldn't build a more credible witness than Robert Bob Taylor if you tried. Bob was 61 years old in 1979. He was a no-nonsense Scotsman, a churchgoer, a family man, and a war veteran. He had served in World War II fighting in the Tank Corps. He had seen the horrors of war, he had seen the world, and he had come back to Scotland to live a quiet, grounded life. He wasn't a man who read science fiction. He wasn't a man who believed in little green men. In fact, when the topic of UFOs came up in the pub, Bob was the guy rolling his eyes and changing the subject to football or the weather. His job reflected his personality. He was a forestry foreman for the Livingston Development Corporation. For those of you who don't know, a forestry foreman is basically the head ranger for a specific district. His job was to manage the thousands of acres of woodland surrounding the new town of Livingston near Edinburgh. He knew every tree, every path, every deer trail, and every fence line in Dechmont Woods. He spent his life outdoors. He knew what a badger looked like. He knew what a weather balloon looked like. He knew what a helicopter looked like. He was a professional observer of the natural world. So when Bob Taylor said he saw something, people listened. It was November 9th, 1979, a Friday. The morning was crisp and cold, typical for November in Scotland. A low mist hung over the fields, and the frost was just beginning to melt off the grass. Bob started his day like any other. He kissed his wife, Mary, goodbye, grabbed his packed lunch, and hopped into his work truck, a sturdy, beat-up Ford pickup that had seen better days but always ran. Sitting in the passenger seat was his partner, not a human partner, but his dog, Laura. Laura was a red setter, a breed known for being high energy, but also very intelligent. She was Bob's constant companion in the woods. Around 10 a.m., Bob drove the truck off the main road and onto a forestry track at the base of Dechmont Law. Law is a Scottish word for a hill, so this was basically Dechmont Hill. It's not a massive mountain, but a prominent rise covered in dense pine plantation and older deciduous trees. Bob had a specific task that morning. He needed to check a fence line near the M8 motorway to make sure stray sheep or cattle hadn't broken through into the young tree plantations. He parked the truck in a small lay-by, grabbed his walking stick, and whistled for Laura. The dog bounded out, tail wagging, nose to the ground, instantly picking up the scents of the forest. Bob lit a cigarette, adjusted his cap, and started walking up the incline. The woods were silent. The M8 motorway was nearby, but the thick wall of trees dampened the noise of the traffic to a distant, ocean-like hum. Inside the tree line, it was just the crunch of boots on pine needles and the rustle of the dog moving through the bracken. About 15 minutes into the walk, Bob turned a corner on the forestry track. This path led into a clearing, a place Bob had been hundreds of times. It was a wide, grassy area surrounded by tall Sitka spruce trees. But on this day, the clearing wasn't empty. Bob stopped dead in his tracks. He blinked, taking the cigarette out of his mouth. He expected to see a poacher's truck, or maybe a pile of fly-tipped trash. Instead, hovering silently about 20 feet above the grass was a machine. This wasn't a saucer. It wasn't a cigar. It was a sphere. A massive, dark gray sphere, about 20 feet in diameter. Bob stood there, his brain trying to categorize what he was seeing. Was it a water tank? No, it was floating. Was it a helicopter? No, there were no rotor blades, and it was dead silent. Was it a gasometer? No, those don't fly. The object had a strange, menacing texture. Bob later described it as looking like dark sandpaper or emery stone. It didn't reflect light, it seemed to absorb it. It looked heavy, industrial, and completely alien to the natural environment. Around the center of the sphere was a flange, a wide rim that looked like the brim of a hat. Set into this rim were what looked like small propellers or rotors, but they weren't spinning, they were just there. Bob wasn't scared yet. He was confused. He was a rational man, remember? He stood there thinking, what on earth is the military testing in my woods? Lara, however, was not confused. She was terrified. The dog, usually fearless, let out a low, guttural growl. Her hackles, the hair along her spine, stood straight up. She backed away, hiding behind Bob's legs, whining. Bob took a step forward. He wanted to get a better look, and that was his mistake. The moment Bob moved, the sphere reacted. From the bottom of the large object, two smaller objects dropped out. They didn't fall, they descended with purpose. These smaller objects were spheres too, but much smaller, maybe 3 feet wide. And they were covered in spikes. Bob said they looked exactly like old naval sea mines from World War II. Think of a dark metal ball with long metal spikes sticking out in every direction. They hit the ground with a soft thud and immediately started rolling. They weren't rolling randomly. They were rolling toward Bob. They moved fast. They kicked up mud and grass as they picked up speed. One veered to the left, the other to the right, executing a perfect pincer movement to flank him. Bob froze. The rational part of his brain shut down, and the soldier part kicked in. But before he could turn to run, the sea mines were on him. They reached his feet at the exact same moment. One attached itself to his right leg, the other to his left. The spikes snagged onto his thick forestry trousers. Then Bob heard a sound. It was a sharp, hissing noise, like a vacuum seal being broken, or a hydraulic piston engaging. Thunk. He felt a sudden, intense smell hit him. It was overpowering. It smelled like burning brake pads, that acrid, sulfurous stench of hot friction and melting rubber. Then came the pull. The balls didn't explode. They pulled. They dragged him forward, toward the hovering mothership. Bob was a strong man. He dug his heels into the mud. He grabbed onto the grass. He screamed at Lara to run, but the force was irresistible. It was like being towed by a tractor. He was dragged across the grass, his boots carving furrows in the earth. The large, sandpaper sphere loomed over him, silent and waiting. He felt a sensation of choking. The smell was filling his lungs, suffocating him. His vision began to blur. He felt a terrible pressure in his head, like his brain was swelling. He looked up one last time at the dark, silent machine hovering above him. And then, everything went black. Bob didn't know how long he was out. It could have been minutes. It could have been an hour. The first thing he noticed was the silence. The hissing was gone. The smell was faint, but still lingering in the back of his throat. He was lying face down in the wet grass. His head was throbbing with a pain so intense it blinded him. His throat felt like he had swallowed a handful of sand. He rolled over. The clearing was empty. The giant sphere was gone. The sea mines were gone. But he wasn't alone. Lara was standing over him, barking frantically. She was licking his face, nudging him, trying to wake him up. The dog was in a panic. Bob tried to sit up, but his legs wouldn't work. They felt like jelly. He looked down at his trousers. They were ruined. The thick, serge material, the kind of tough fabric that police uniforms are made of, was ripped to shreds at the hips. It wasn't just a tear. It looked like the fabric had been grabbed and violently yanked upward, shearing the threads. His legs were covered in red grazes. He tried to speak to the dog. "It's okay, girl," he wanted to say. But no sound came out. He opened his mouth, but his voice was gone. He could only make a croaking, wheezing sound. Panic set in. He was injured, mute, and alone in the woods where something had just attacked him. He had to get out. He couldn't stand, so he crawled. He dragged himself through the mud, inch by inch, back toward the forestry track. Eventually, he managed to stagger to his feet, using his walking stick like a crutch. He stumbled down the path, swaying like a drunkard. He reached his truck. He fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking violently. He got the door open and fell into the driver's seat. He reached for the two-way radio on the dashboard. He pressed the button to call his depot. Base. Base. Nothing. He physically couldn't form the words. He was just wheezing into the microphone. He gave up on the radio. He tried to start the truck. He turned the key. Click! The truck, which had never failed him, was dead. The battery was completely drained. Now, Bob was truly terrified. He was stranded. He forced himself out of the truck and began the long walk home. It was a mile back to his house in the town of Livingston. He walked it in a daze, stumbling, falling, getting back up. He was covered in mud, his pants were ripped, his eyes were wild. When Bob finally stumbled through his front door, his wife Mary screamed. He looked like he had been in a car wreck. He was pale, shaking, and covered in dirt. He collapsed onto the sofa. Bob, what happened? Was it a crash? Bob shook his head. He pointed to his throat. He gestured for water. He drank glass after glass, desperate to wash the taste of burning brakes out of his mouth. Slowly, his voice began to return, croaky and weak. I was attacked, he whispered. Attacked? By who? A gang? No, Bob said, staring at the wall with a 1,000-yard stare. By a spaceship. Mary paused. If anyone else had said this, she would have called the asylum. But this was Bob. Bob didn't lie, Bob didn't tell stories, and Bob was clearly in physical shock. She didn't laugh. She did exactly what you would expect a sensible woman to do when her husband comes home assaulted. She called the police. This is where the story shifts from a typical UFO encounter to a unique historical event. The call came into the Livingston police station. My husband has been assaulted in the woods. Detective Sergeant Ian Wark took the call. He didn't know about the spaceship part yet. He just knew a forestry worker had been attacked. He grabbed a constable and drove to the Taylor house. When they arrived, they saw Bob. They saw the torn trousers. They saw the grazes on his legs. They saw a man who was clearly traumatized. Bob told them the story. He told them about the sphere, the sea mines, the smell, the blackout. DS Work was a seasoned cop. He listened. He didn't roll his eyes. He looked at Bob's demeanor. He saw a man who was telling the truth, or at least the truth as he perceived it. Show us, Work said. They drove back to the woods. It was dark now, but they had heavy police torches. Bob led them up the track. But when they got close to the clearing, something strange happened. Laura, the dog, refused to go any further. She stopped on the track and started whimpering. This was a dog that spent her life in these woods. She was terrified of that clearing. Bob tied her to a tree and they continued on foot. When the police shined their lights on the clearing, they stopped. There, in the wet grass, was physical evidence. They found 2 parallel tracks. They looked like ladder marks, impressions in the soil about 8 feet apart. They looked as if a heavy machine with tank treads or some kind of landing gear had pressed into the earth. But there were no tracks leading into the clearing and no tracks leading out. Whatever made those marks had come straight down from the sky and gone straight back up. Surrounding these ladder marks were 40 small circular holes. They were punched into the soil, arranged in a pattern. These matched Bob's description of the sea mines bouncing or rolling toward him. D.S. Wark cordoned off the scene. He called in forensics. For the next few weeks, Dechmont Woods was a crime scene. The police treated it exactly like an assault. 1. The trousers. Bob's ripped trousers were sent to a forensic crime lab in Edinburgh. The analysis came back with a bizarre result. The tears weren't caused by snagging on a branch or barbed wire. The fabric had been subjected to a strong upward force. The way the threads were snapped indicated that something had hooked onto the waistband and pulled up with mechanical strength. 2. The tracks. The police analyzed the ground marks. They determined that the object that made them weighed several tons. They checked with the Forestry Commission. No heavy machinery had been in that area for months. They checked with the water board, the electric board, nothing. 3. The truck. A mechanic looked at Bob's truck. The battery was dead, but there was no obvious mechanical reason for it. It was just drained. 4. The health check. Bob was examined by a doctor. He had a graze on his chin and bruises on his legs consistent with being dragged. But more worryingly, he had symptoms of radiation sickness or chemical exposure, intense thirst, headache, and nausea that lasted for days. The police were stumped. They checked flight logs. No helicopters were in the area. They checked with the Royal Air Force. No exercises were happening. D.S. Wark, the lead investigator, went on record. He said, "I am completely convinced that Robert Taylor saw something. He is not a man who would make this up. The physical evidence indicates that a heavy object of unknown origin landed in that clearing." The theories. Of course, when the story hit the papers, the skeptics came out in force. Theory 1, the water tank. A local skeptic claimed Bob had seen a water tank saucer, but the water tank in question was miles away, cemented to the ground, and didn't have propellers. And crucially, water tanks don't attack people. Theory 2, epilepsy. Doctors suggested Bob had a temporal lobe seizure. This can cause hallucinations and a bad smell. Phantom smells are a symptom, but Bob had no history of epilepsy. He had passed rigorous medical exams for the war and his job. And epilepsy doesn't tear your trousers or leave ladder marks in the mud. Theory 3, the mirage. Someone suggested he saw a mirage of the planet Venus. In the morning, in Scotland, through a thick pine forest, it was a laughable stretch. Theory 4, secret military tech. This is the only one Bob himself entertained. He wondered if he had stumbled upon a secret hovering device, maybe a prototype Harrier jump jet drone or something similar. But if it was the British military, why attack a civilian? Why leave him there? And why has no record of such a device ever surfaced in 50 years? Bob Taylor never sought fame. He never tried to sell a book. He never went on the convention circuit. In fact, he eventually moved to a quiet bungalow in a different town just to get away from the UFO enthusiasts who kept knocking on his door. He stood by his story until the day he died in 2007. He would get angry if people called it a UFO. He would say, "I don't know what it was. I'm just telling you what happened." The police file remains open. To this day, the assault on Robert Taylor is classified as unsolved. If you go to Dechmont Woods today, you can walk the Robert Taylor Trail. There's a plaque in the clearing where it happened. It's a peaceful place now, popular with dog walkers. But the locals will tell you something strange. They say that even now, 50 years later, some dogs, especially red setters, will refuse to enter that clearing. They'll stop at the edge of the trees, hackles raised, growling at the empty air, sensing the memory of the machine that smelled like burning brakes. So, if you're ever hiking in Scotland and you see a strange dark sphere hovering in the mist, don't be like Bob. Don't go investigate. Just turn around and run. And that, folks, is the legacy of Dechmont Woods. The only time in history the police officially treated a UFO encounter as a criminal assault. Bob Taylor went to his grave telling the truth as he saw it, and the physical evidence left in that clearing suggests he didn't imagine a thing. But I want to know what you think. Was this a secret military test gone wrong? Or did Bob stumble upon something truly out of this world? Let me know your theories in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive, do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel to keep the signal strong. And listen, if you've had your own brush with the unexplained, whether it's a strange light in the sky or something stalking you in the woods, I want to hear about it. Send your stories to mycreepyencounter@gmail.com. We might just read them on a future broadcast. I'm Midnight Rider. This is Channel 19 Mysteries. Stay safe out there.